But in the spring of 1814, Britain looks across the Atlantic and goes, right, we've got some unfinished business over there. And they acted fast. August 24th, the British, they marched straight into Washington, D.C., and they burned down the White House, the Capitol, most of the government buildings. In a famous act, Dolly Madison saves the portrait of George Washington on her way out the door. So fast forward to September of 1814, the British hit Baltimore. Fort McHenry, though, it holds. That's where Francis Scott Key writes the famous song that becomes our national anthem. But the British, well, they're not quite done. They have a much bigger target in mind, New Orleans. Now, by today, you wouldn't think New Orleans was big, but here's where it gets interesting. New Orleans in 1814 is not just some charming city with good food and jazz. Jazz doesn't even exist yet. New Orleans, though, is the key to the entire Mississippi River. Whoever controls the New Orleans controls everything that flows out of the American interior. So that's cotton, that's sugar, that's trade of all kinds. The entire economic future of the western United States really depends on the Mississippi River. So their plan is simple. Take New Orleans, control the Mississippi, and then, honestly, they probably will just keep it. The treaty negotiations happening in Ghent, well, those would have looked very, very different if Britain was sitting on the most important port in North America at the time. So they assemble a massive force, about 11,000 men total, under Major General Sir Edward Pakenham. Pakenham, he is the real deal. He's the brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington himself. He's fought all through the Peninsular Wars. He knows what he's doing. He's not a rookie. The British fleet sails into the Gulf of Mexico in December of 1814, and here's where they start landing troops. And they assume this is going to be, well, not really easy per se, but pretty straightforward. They're Wellington's veterans, after all. They've broken Napoleon's armies. You know, what is a collection of American militia going to do to them? Well, they're about to find out. Now, before Andrew Jackson even gets to New Orleans, and before any of this comes together, there's a moment that honestly changes American history forever, and it involves the aforementioned pirate, Jean Lafitte. If you've heard that name, it's probably connected to smugglers or perhaps a treasure, and it's all the things that you'd associate early 19th century piracy with. Lafitte and his brother Pierre ran an operation out of Baratarian Bay, just south of New Orleans. They smuggled goods, they raided ships, they had warehouses and warehouses full of stolen merchandise. They sold things at incredibly low prices that made the local merchants absolutely furious. There were literally wanted posters for him, just kind of like the Old West. The governor of Louisiana had put a $500 price on his head, and that actually amounts to about $12,000 in today's money. So let's go to early September 1814. A British ship shows up at Barataria. They send officers ashore to meet with Lafitte, and the British make him an offer. They say, join us, help us take New Orleans. In exchange for this, you get a captain's commission in the Royal Navy, land in British territory, and a full pardon as well. And that's a full pardon for everything he's ever done. All the smuggling, all the piracy, all of it. He just gets a clean slate, plus money, plus status in the Royal Navy. Here's one thing, though, that really nobody talks about. Lafitte did not take the deal. He didn't even hesitate. He didn't. Instead, he took the British officers, gave them some wine, told them he needed a few days to think about things, and then the moment they left, he sent the entire British battle plan straight to the American authorities. Let that sink in for just a moment. He's a wanted pirate, a man with a bounty on his head, and he gets offered a full pardon, commission, and money by the most powerful empire on earth. And he decided to bet on the Americans instead. Now, why would he do this? Well, nobody really knows for sure. Lafitte later said he did it out of patriotism, and maybe he did. He also might have looked at the situation and decided the British were unlikely to honor that deal and use him. Or maybe he just wanted to stay in Louisiana, where he'd built a successful, albeit illegal, business that was doing really well. The British were offering to relocate him, so whatever his reasoning was, whatever he needed out of the deal, the Americans, though, they didn't immediately thank him. In fact, a few days later, after Lafitte sent that warning, the U.S. Navy attacked Barataria. They burned his base, seized his ships, and arrested his brother. The Americans literally thanked this man by destroying everything he had. But Lafitte, he didn't walk away. And that's going to matter in a big way. As we move forward to December 1st, 1814, Andrew Jackson arrives in New Orleans. Jackson, at this point, he's already a legend in certain circles. He just finished crushing the Creek Indians in a brutal campaign through present-day Alabama. He's tough. He's relentless. His men, well, they called him Old Hickory because he's about as flexible as a hickory tree, which is to say he pretty much had no flexibility at all. Well, Jackson surveys the defenses around New Orleans and realizes the situation is just bad. There may be 1,000 regular army troops in the area. The city's fortifications are, to put it mildly, inadequate. The British are landing veteran forces by the day, so Jackson does what Jackson does. He starts building an army, a full army out of whatever he can find. Tennessee and Kentucky militia, these are the guys with the long rifles. The Kentucky rifle, it was deadly accurate to 200 yards at an era where most military muskets couldn't hit a barn from that distance. You can learn about the weapons of the Revolution right here. He recruits New Orleans businessmen, local Creole militia, free men of color. There was a significant community of free black men in New Orleans who formed 2 battalions. He also had Choctaw warriors who knew the swamps better than anyone else around. Then he does something surprising. He goes to Jean Lafitte. Now remember, Lafitte's base had been destroyed by the U.S. Navy a few months earlier. His brother was already in jail. He had every reason to tell the Americans to plainly just go pound sand. But Jackson, he needed what Lafitte had. Specifically, 3 things. 1, flints. The flint used in flintlock rifles. Without flints, obviously your rifle is a very expensive club. And Lafitte had thousands of them. Jackson later wrote that those flints, quote, contributed much to the defense of the city. The second thing that Jackson needed was gunpowder. The Americans were desperately short after the Revolution, and Lafitte, he had warehouses full. 3 men. Lafitte's pirates were also expert artillerymen. They knew cannons, and Jackson needed cannoneers. So Lafitte and his men joined the bizarre coalition with Jackson. Pirates fighting alongside Choctaw warriors, fighting alongside Tennessee frontiersmen, fighting alongside New Orleans merchants. It was crazy. I can't even imagine what that camp looked like. The logistics alone. Jackson makes a strategic decision. Instead of fighting the British in open combat, which would be suicide against their numbers and training, of course, he'll make them come to him. He builds a fortified line along Rodriguez Canal at Chalmette Plantation, about 5 miles downriver from New Orleans. This thing is basically a muddy ditch with a wall made of earth, some timber, and cotton bales. The British, well, they call this a contemptible earthwork. They are not impressed in the least bit. Parkenham, he looks at this muddy wall and sees realistically a minor obstacle. His men, well, they just faced Napoleon's artillery. Surely, how hard can it be to handle some cotton bales? Well, here's where the story is about to get really interesting. We fast forward to January 8th, 1815. Heavy fog. The British advance in 2 main columns, roughly 8,000 men in total. The plan is pretty straightforward. March across the open field, overwhelm the American line with sheer numbers, and take New Orleans by lunchtime, and then probably have afternoon tea. There's one critical problem. Colonel Mullins of the British 44th Regiment of the Foot was supposed to bring the ladders and the fascines. Fascines are bundles of sticks used to fill in ditches so soldiers can cross them. Ladders, well, ladders, they're pretty self-explanatory. They're ladders. You need ladders to get over a wall. Even though it was a makeshift wall, you still need a ladder to get over it. The British need both to cross that muddy ditch and to scale that American earthworks thing that they built. I'll just call it a thing. Mullins, well, he forgot them. He literally left them behind. So picture this. Here comes 8,000 of the world's best soldiers marching in perfect formation across an open field, highly trained, straight at a fortified American position. And then they get to this ditch and they have nothing to cross it with. They're literally standing in front of the wall that they cannot climb in an open field with zero cover. And then the Americans open fire. The fog lifts. The sun comes out. And those Kentucky and Tennessee riflemen, the ones with the long rifles, they start picking off British officers one by one at 150 yards, 200 yards, distances where a British musket basically is a noisemaker and it can't reach the Americans. The American riflemen are just plain lethal. General Pakenham is hit. He keeps going. He is very courageous. Then his horse is shot out from under him as well. He mounts another person's horse. He's hit again. He's helped up. And then he's hit a third time. And this one kills him. His second in command, Major General Samuel Gibbs, is also mortally wounded within minutes. A third senior officer, Major General John Keane, is shot and carried off from the field. In the span of roughly 30 minutes in total, the British Army at New Orleans has lost its commanding general, its second in command, and its third highest ranking officer. The soldiers, well, they keep coming because that's what Wellington's veterans do, but it's a slaughter. The total British casualties, over 2,000. Some estimates put it closer to 2,500. American casualties, they total only 71. Let that sink in. 2,000 versus 71. The British called it the American Agincourt. That was a British understatement for we just got absolutely destroyed. Now, here's the twist. On December 24th, 1814, 2 weeks prior to any shot being fired at New Orleans, American and British diplomats in Ghent, Belgium, signed the Treaty of Ghent. The war was over. Peace was made, but news in that time traveled at the speed of a sailing ship. It took weeks for word to cross the Atlantic. Nobody, and I mean nobody in Louisiana knew. Nobody in the British fleet even knew. So 2,000 British soldiers and 71 Americans, they died for a war that was already ended. And even the fastest ships couldn't outrun that tragedy. Here's the thing that really nobody talks about and what this battle actually meant. Even though it was technically pointless from a military perspective because the war was over, the Battle of New Orleans, well, it gave America something it desperately needed. It gave it a story. The War of 1812 as a whole was not a glorious affair for the United States. The British burned the White House after all. American invasions of Canada failed because at that time it was British Canada, and they failed repeatedly. The U.S. Navy had some bright moments, but they were still hopelessly outmatched at this point. The country was deeply, deeply divided. New England states were literally talking about secession at this point, and then out of nowhere comes this absolute triumph. The British, the same British who just crushed Napoleon, they got humiliated by a ragtag army that included pirates, if you can believe that. It was the biggest American land victory of the entire war by far. It didn't change the treaty at all. It didn't even change the outcome. But what it did do is it changed how Americans felt about themselves. It changed the story Americans told themselves about who they were. Andrew Jackson, well, he became a national hero overnight. He was already popular, but now he's just a national hero. He rode that wave for the next 13 years, straight to the White House. The Battle of New Orleans really made Andrew Jackson president. And Jean Lafitte, he got a pardon from President Madison. He went back to piracy, though, and eventually he just disappeared somewhere in the Caribbean or Texas. Nobody really knows. His treasure, if it exists or existed, has never been found. If that is not a classic pirate ending, I don't know what is. So the next time someone tells you the British were a tough opponent, but America won its wars fair and square, well, the Battle of New Orleans says kind of, with pirates, mud, cotton bales, and one British colonel who forgot the ladders. This is the kind of story that doesn't make it into the history books or the textbooks, or at least not the interesting parts. Of course, they'll teach you the date. It's January 8th, 1815. They might mention Andrew Jackson. They probably won't mention that the most important logistics officer in the entire battle was a wanted pirate, or that the war had already ended, or that a guy named Mullins left the ladders behind and it got 2,000 or more of his fellow soldiers killed. But that is the real story. So if you've enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe for more untold stories. And as always, I want to wish you a great day, a pleasant evening, and a wonderful week ahead. Thank you.